Hello, my name is Daphne. I am 69 years old, and I run a tiny dog cafe where my loyal corgi is the soul of the place. Every day, people come not just for coffee, but for warmth, for comfort, for a moment of peace. That morning felt ordinary, till an arrogant stranger I had never seen before ordered a coffee and a croissant. Minutes later, his face twisted with rage. He slammed his hand on the counter, stormed out, and snarled, "This place is disgusting. You should shut down this pathetic dump full of stinking dogs." When the door crashed shut behind him, my hands were still shaking. As I cleared the table, I noticed a folded note hidden under his coffee cup. When I read it, my blood ran cold. In that instant, I knew his anger had nothing to do with the cafe, and everything to do with something dark he didn't want uncovered. That note would change my life forever. It pulled me into a truth about betrayal, family, greed, and cruelty that I never imagined could touch someone like me. What started as a quiet morning with my dog became the beginning of a fight I didn't ask for, but couldn't walk away from. But before we continue, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching from. I truly love reading your comments and knowing where you come from. Now, let's understand how this story really began. I have always believed that places absorb the souls of those who care for them. Every morning, when I unlocked the front door of my little dog cafe in Portland, I felt Thomas there with me, in the warmth of the espresso machine, in the soft creak of the wooden floor, in the quiet happiness that settled into my chest as Mimi trotted in behind me, nails clicking, tail wagging like the world had never heard her. At 69, my routines were sacred. I wiped the counters slowly. I arranged the pastries just so. I brewed the first pot of coffee while Mimi stationed herself near the window, greeting regulars with her gentle, expectant eyes. She wasn't just a corgi. She was comfort. She was continuity. She was the reason strangers smiled without realizing why. That morning felt ordinary, till it wasn't. The bell above the door rang sharply, not the polite chime I was used to, but a violent shake, as if someone had yanked it on purpose. I looked up and saw a man standing just inside the doorway. Mid-40s, maybe? Expensive coat, tight jaw, eyes that swept the room with open disgust. He didn't greet me, didn't acknowledge Mimi. He simply barked, "Coffee, black, and one of those croissants." His tone made my shoulders tense, but I smiled anyway. Years of running this cafe had taught me that kindness was sometimes the only armor an older woman was allowed. "Of course," I said gently. "You're welcome to sit anywhere." He snorted, "I'm not sitting in a place like this." I watched him pace instead, hands clenched, eyes narrowing as Mimi wandered a little too close, curious and hopeful. When she sniffed his shoe, he recoiled. "Disgusting," he muttered. Louder then, "Who would run a business full of stinking dogs?" Something inside me tightened. Not anger, something sadder, protective. "She's family," I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. "And so are most of the people who come here." He laughed, short and cruel. "Figures." I handed him his coffee and pastry. He slapped a bill on the counter, snatched his food, and leaned closer than necessary. "People like you should learn to stay in their lane," he said quietly, "especially when it comes to things that don't belong to you." Before I could ask what he meant, he turned and stormed out, the bell screaming in protest behind him. I stood there for a long moment, heart pounding, Mimi pressing her warm body against my leg as if she sensed something had shifted. It was only when I reached to clear his cup that I saw it. A folded piece of paper, thick, intentional. My hands shook as I opened it. "Stop asking questions about the Riverside property or your cafe will burn down. This is your only warning." The room seemed to tilt. I sat down hard in the nearest chair, the note trembling between my fingers. Riverside property? I hadn't asked anyone anything. I hadn't even known there was a question to ask. Mimi whined softly, placing her chin on my knee. I buried my fingers in her fur, breathing her in, grounding myself in the simple truth of her presence. Thomas's face floated into my mind. My younger brother. His tired smile near the end. The way he'd squeezed my hand in the hospital and whispered, "I need to tell you something important." The phone felt heavy in my hand as I called my niece. Emma answered on the third ring. Her voice was tight. "Too tight, Aunt Daphne," she said. We need to talk." Something in her tone made my stomach drop. "Emma," I said softly. "What's wrong?" There was a pause, a breath that sounded like it hurt. "I'm coming over," she said. "Please, don't be mad yet." When she arrived, she looked like a stranger, pale, hands shaking, eyes red as if she'd already cried herself empty. She sat across from me, Mimi curling at her feet, trusting without question. I envied that innocence. "Aunt Daphne," she whispered, "I've done something terrible." The words landed like a slow fracture, spreading quietly through my chest. It involves my dad's will, and in that moment, sitting in the cafe I'd built with love and stubborn hope, I knew my life had just tilted onto a path I couldn't step away from. I reached across the table and took her trembling hands. "Tell me," I said. Emma cried the way people do when they have been holding themselves together for far too long, not loud at first, no drama, just a quiet collapse. Her shoulders caved inward, her hands twisted together in her lap, and her breath came out in short, broken pulls, as if even breathing required permission she no longer had. "I didn't know how to tell you," she whispered. "Every time I tried, I saw Uncle Thomas's face, and yours, and I just froze." I sat across from her at the small cafe table, the threatening note folded and refolded so many times it had gone soft at the edges. Mimi lay between us, her body pressed against Emma's feet, offering warmth without judgment. I wondered how many times my brother had needed that same quiet comfort and never received it. "Tell me everything," I said gently. My voice sounded older than usual, heavier. Emma swallowed. "Dad, he changed his will before he died. He left you the Riverside property. All of it." The words landed slowly, like stones sinking into deep water. Riverside. Suddenly, the note made sense. The stranger's anger, his eyes, his certainty that I should stay in my lane. "I never saw the will," she continued, tears spilling freely now. "Victor did. He said it was a mistake, that your name had been added by accident. He told me he'd fix it." My hands clenched around my coffee cup. It had gone cold, but I hadn't noticed. "He didn't fix it," I said quietly. Emma shook her head. "He forged documents, transfer papers. He made it look like Dad had signed everything over to him before he died." The room felt too small, too quiet. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator, the distant traffic outside, Mimi's steady breathing. Life continuing as if something sacred hadn't just been torn apart. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, and immediately hated how much pain that question carried. Emma looked up, eyes red and desperate. "Because I was scared," she said. "He told me if I said anything, you'd lose the cafe. He said accidents happen to places like yours. Old buildings, faulty wiring." The note burned in my pocket. "I thought I could live with it," she whispered. "I thought the money didn't matter. But then he started acting like it was never your family's to begin with, like your brother owed him." Something inside me broke then. Not loudly, just a quiet tearing. It wasn't about the property, or the money. It was the idea that Thomas, my gentle, anxious, stubborn little brother, had been afraid in his final days. That someone he trusted had stood over him and taken advantage of his weakness. That family had become a weapon. "I should have protected him," I said, without realizing I'd spoken. Emma reached for my hand. "You couldn't have known. But I had known something was wrong. I had felt it. And I had ignored it, choosing peace over discomfort, silence over questions. That afternoon, I locked the cafe early. The bell sounded wrong as I turned the sign to closed. Mimi followed me out, her short legs moving quickly, as if she sensed urgency. Gerald's office smelled like old paper and lemon polish. He had been Thomas's lawyer too, a careful man, a kind one, the sort who listened more than he spoke. He greeted me with concern the moment he saw my face. "What's happened?" he asked. I placed the documents on his desk with hands that no longer trembled. Shock had given way to something colder, clearer. "These were used to take my brother's property," I said, "and this was the man who threatened me." Gerald adjusted his glasses and began to read. The room fell into a deep, oppressive silence. Mimi settled at my feet, her warmth steady and reassuring. Minutes passed, then more. I watched Gerald's expression change confusion first, then disbelief, then something close to fear. His fingers paused on a page that wasn't supposed to be there. He looked up at me, his face drained of color. "Daphne," he said quietly, "this is worse than fraud." My heart sank, slid a document across the desk, a hospital report. Dates circled, notes in the margins. "Your brother didn't die of natural causes," he said. "Look at this." Gerald didn't speak right away. He leaned back in his chair, one hand pressed to his mouth, the other resting on the file as if it might try to escape. "Thomas was admitted 3 days before he died," he finally said. "The medication schedule was altered, not by the attending physician, by someone who had access." The words felt unreal, like they belonged to another family, another life. "He was under pressure," Gerald continued carefully. "Hospital notes mention agitation, fear. He asked for a notary. Twice. The second request was denied because he was deemed too confused, yet somehow lucid enough to sign property transfers the next day." I stared at the desk, my vision blurring. Thomas had always been anxious, but near the end, he had been different. Quiet in a way that wasn't peaceful. His eyes had followed shadows no one else could see. "I need to tell you something important," he had whispered to me that last afternoon. His fingers had trembled in mine. "Just not here." I never went back the next day. I told myself there would be time. There wasn't. I left Gerald's office feeling hollowed out, as if grief had finally found its sharpest edge. Mimi walked close to my leg, brushing against me with each step, reminding me that I was still here, that I still had a body, a choice. By the time I reached home, my decision had already formed. Quiet, certain. I was going to Riverside. The drive felt longer than it should have. The city thinned, replaced by trees and silence. Thomas had loved this land. He used to bring me here when we were younger, talk about turning it into something gentle someday. A retreat. A place for second chances. The gate was unlocked. That should have been my first warning. Mimi whined softly as we stepped out of the car. The air smelled wrong, sharp, sour, layered with something metallic. I followed the sound before I saw anything. Whimpering. Not one voice, but many. Overlapping. Desperate. Behind a line of trees sat a long, low structure that hadn't been there before. Windows covered, doors chained. My heart pounded as I approached. Inside, the sight stole the breath from my lungs. Dogs. Dozens of them, crammed into cages barely big enough to turn around. Matted fur, raw skin, eyes dulled by exhaustion and fear. Puppies pressed against their mothers, nursing from bodies that had nothing left to give. "Oh my God," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. Mimi growled low in her throat, a sound I had never heard from her before. Protective. Furious. My hands shook as I took out my phone. I photographed everything. The cages. The conditions. The paperwork pinned to a wall, shipping schedule, fake breeding licenses, Victor's name everywhere. This wasn't just theft. This was cruelty. Calculated. Profitable. I was backing away when I heard footsteps. "Well, look at you," a voice said behind me. Cold. Familiar. Victor stood in the doorway, smiling without humor. "You shouldn't have come here, old woman," he said. "Now you've left me no choice." He lunged. I barely had time to scream before Mimi launched herself forward, teeth sinking into his ankle. He howled, stumbling back, and I ran, heart pounding, lungs burning, carrying the weight of every suffering animal with me. I didn't stop until I reached the car. As I drove away, shaking and breathless, one thought burned brighter than fear. Thomas hadn't just been betrayed. He had been silenced. And now, it was my turn to speak. I didn't remember the drive back from Riverside. Only fragments stayed with me, the way my hands refused to stop shaking on the steering wheel. The taste of fear, sharp and metallic at the back of my throat. Mimi's small body pressed against my leg as if anchoring me to the world. I pulled over twice just to breathe, just to remind myself that I was alive, that Victor's shadow was no longer behind me. The moment I reached the cafe, I locked the door and called animal control, then the police. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, steady, precise, almost calm, as if something inside me had finally hardened into purpose. They arrived faster than I expected. Detective Rachel Morrison was not what I had imagined. She was younger than me, but her eyes carried the kind of quiet seriousness that comes from having seen too much. She crouched to greet Mimi before she spoke to me, letting my dog sniff her hand, waiting for trust instead of demanding it. "Tell me what you saw," she said. So I did everything. I didn't rush. I didn't soften the details. I described the cages, the smell, the eyes of the dogs that no longer expected kindness. I told her about the forged documents, the threats, the note under the coffee cup. When I spoke about Thomas, my voice faltered, but she didn't interrupt. She let the silence do its work. When I finished, she nodded slowly. "You did the right thing," she said, "and I believe you." Those words loosened something tight in my chest. I hadn't realized how afraid I was of not being believed, of being dismissed as an old woman imagining danger where there was none. Rachel stayed late, sitting at one of the cafe tables as we spread everything out, the documents Gerald had given me, the photos from Riverside, Thomas's medical records with their careful annotations and quiet red flags. Each piece felt heavier than the last. Together they formed a picture I didn't want to see, but could no longer ignore. Emma arrived just before closing. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, as if crossing the threshold required courage she wasn't sure she had left. Mimi went to her immediately, tail wagging, pressing her head into Emma's knees. Emma sank down onto the floor and wrapped her arms around her, sobbing into soft fur. "I'll testify," she said finally, looking up at me through tears. "I'm terrified, but I won't let him do this anymore." I crossed the room and held her the way I used to when she was a child. I felt how small she'd made herself to survive, how fear had trained her to be quiet. "You're not alone," I whispered. Not anymore. The cafe changed that night. It was no longer just a place for coffee and gentle conversations. It became a sanctuary of truth. A place where papers stayed spread across tables, where phones rang softly with updates, where Mimi moved from person to person, offering silent comfort like it was her calling. Rachel checked in daily. Animal control confirmed the conditions were worse than we'd feared. Charges were being prepared. Warrants drafted. For the first time since Thomas died, I felt something like forward motion. Painful, exhausting, but real. Then the bell rang. Victor walked in as if he still belonged there. He wore a polished smile and was flanked by a man in a tailored suit carrying a leather briefcase. The air shifted instantly. Conversation stopped. Mimi stood rigid at my side. Victor's eyes flicked over the documents, the detective badge, Emma's pale face. He smiled wider. "This is harassment," his lawyer said smoothly. "Defamation, trespassing, emotional distress." Victor leaned in close to me. "I'll take everything you have," he said softly, "including this pathetic cafe. You have 48 hours to drop this." I met his gaze, my heart pounding, but I didn't look away. No, I said, and for the first time, I meant it without fear. I slept very little after Victor's threat. Every sound outside my apartment felt louder than it should have been. A passing car, a distant siren. Mimi stayed pressed against my back the entire night, her warmth steady, her breathing slow, as if she was lending me the calm my body refused to find on its own. By morning, fear had settled into something else. Resolve. When I unlocked the cafe, my hands no longer shook. I brewed coffee like I always did. I placed the pastries carefully. I kissed Mimi's head and whispered, "We're not hiding." Helen arrived first. She always did. A retired English teacher with silver hair pulled into a neat bun and eyes that missed nothing. She took one look at my face and didn't ask about the menu. "Sit," she said, pointing to a chair. "Tell me." So I did. I told her about Thomas, about Riverside, about the dogs, about the threats and the lies and the way betrayal feels heavier when it comes wrapped in family. Helen listened the way good teachers do, without interrupting, without rushing you to the end. When I finished, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "They picked the wrong woman," she said simply. James came next. A veteran who carried himself quietly, his posture straight even when he relaxed. He listened with his arms folded, jaw tight. When I told him about Victor's warning, his eyes hardened. "I'll take the night shift," he said. No arguments. By noon, Sophie had arrived with her toddler balanced on one hip. She set her child down with crayons and listened, tears filling her eyes as I described the dogs at Riverside. "My sister volunteers at a shelter," she said softly. "Tell me what you need." And just like that, something shifted. They made a schedule on a napkin. Who would stay late? Who would come early? Who would walk Mimi if I needed rest? They brought casseroles I didn't remember asking for. They checked the locks. They stood near the windows, watching, not afraid, but alert. The cafe filled with quiet strength. A reporter showed up that afternoon. I hadn't called them. Someone else had. The headline came out the next day, bold and impossible to ignore. Elderly calf owner fights nephew-in-law's puppy mill empire. I didn't love the word elderly, but I loved that the truth was finally out in the open. Donations began arriving. Small ones, large ones. Notes tucked inside envelopes that said things like, "Thank you for not looking away," and my dog was rescued once too. I cried over every single one. For the first time since Thomas died, I felt held up instead of worn down. Then, my phone rang. Detective Morrison's voice was tight, focused, urgent. "Daphne," she said, "we found something in Victor's financial records. He's not working alone." My heart sank. "There's a partner," she continued, "and you know them well." The cafe seemed to fall silent around me. I closed my eyes, Mimi's head resting against my leg, and braced myself for the next betrayal. I knew before Detective Morrison said her name. Some part of me had already begun mourning, quietly, instinctively, the way the body braces before pain fully arrives. "Barbara," Rachel said. The word landed like a fracture through bone. I sat down hard in the nearest chair. The cafe suddenly too bright, too loud, too full of memories that now rearranged themselves into something ugly. Mimi jumped up beside me, pressing her weight against my thigh. I held onto her fur like a lifeline. Barbara. My Barbara. My childhood best friend. The girl who shared secrets with me under blankets and promised we would grow old together. The woman who supplied my cafe with pastries and specialty ingredients. The one who brought soup after Thomas died, who held my hands while I cried and said, "He loved you so much, Daphne." She provided the legitimate front. Rachel continued gently. Invoices, shell companies, distribution channels. On paper, everything looked clean. I barely heard her. All I could see were moments I had trusted without question. Barbara encouraging me not to worry about Riverside. Barbara reminding me that paperwork was boring and exhausting. Barbara saying, "Let Victor handle it. He's good with numbers." Flashbacks surfaced uninvited. Her laughter when I hesitated. Her gentle insistence that I was too emotional. The way she always positioned herself as the reasonable one when I expressed doubt. I had mistaken control for care. She arrived at the cafe that afternoon like she always did. Confident, polished, familiar. The bell chimed. Conversation stopped. Helen's eyes narrowed. James straightened. Barbara smiled when she saw me. Then she noticed the documents on the tables. The detective badge, Emma's pale face. Her smile didn't falter. "So," she said calmly, "I suppose this was inevitable." The word inevitable hurt more than anger would have. "How long?" I asked. My voice sounded far away. She shrugged. "Long enough." I stood, my legs unsteady. "You held me while I cried over my brother." "Yes," she said, "and you cried beautifully." Something in her tone, flat, dismissive, finally shattered what was left of denial. "Thomas trusted you," I said. "I trusted you." Barbara tilted her head. "Your brother was weak," she said, "and you're weak too. Money matters more than your sentimental friendships." The cafe felt like it exhaled in shock. I felt something collapsed inside me, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. Like a structure that had been hollowed out long ago and was only now revealing it had no foundation left. "You used me," I whispered. She smiled, thin and practiced. "You let yourself be used." Then she leaned closer. "Besides," she added quietly, "you can't prove I knew about the puppy mill, but I can't prove you assaulted Victor on his property." Her eyes flicked to Mimi, to the photos, to the past. "Say goodbye to your cafe," she said. I didn't respond. Because beneath the devastation, beneath the grief and betrayal and heartbreak, something else had begun to rise. Not weakness, clarity. And I knew whatever Barbara believed, this story was no longer hers to control. I closed the cafe early that night. Not because I was afraid of Victor or Barbara, but because I couldn't bear the weight of familiar walls watching me fall apart. The chairs were stacked, the lights dimmed, the scent of coffee lingering like a memory that didn't yet know it was about to change. At home, I sat on the floor with my back against the couch and finally let myself cry. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't quiet. It came from a place so deep I felt hollow afterward, like something old had been scooped out and left behind. Betrayal does that. It doesn't just hurt. It rearranges your understanding of the past. Mimi climbed into my lap without hesitation, her small body warm and solid, her head tucked under my chin. She didn't try to lick my tears away. She just stayed. Her presence was steady, unquestioning, loyal in a way that felt almost sacred. "I don't know how to do this," I whispered into her fur. "I'm so tired." She sighed a small sound and leaned into me harder, as if to say, "Then rest, but don't give up." The next morning, Emma came to the cafe before opening. She looked different, older somehow, but clearer. She carried a worn cardboard box, held carefully against her chest like something fragile. "I found these in my dad's old storage unit," she said. They were hidden behind a false panel. Inside were envelopes, yellowed, addressed to me. My breath caught. Thomas's handwriting. Letters he had written but never sent. Page after page of careful words, full of hesitation and love and fear. He wrote about Victor's temper, about financial pressure, about Barbara's help that never felt like help at all. One letter ended abruptly, the ink darker where his hand must have shaken. "If anything happens to me," he wrote, "please don't believe it was my choice." I pressed the papers to my chest and closed my eyes. For the first time since his death, I felt like I was finally hearing him finish his sentence. Rachel came that afternoon. She read everything, slowly, thoroughly. "This changes things," she said. "We can set a trap." The word trap frightened me, but not as much as doing nothing. We planned carefully, methodically. a fake negotiation, an offer to settle. The cafe would be the setting, familiar, disarming. Recording equipment hidden in plain sight. Consent laws satisfied. Everything clean. They'll come, Rachel said. People who think they've won always want to hear you surrender. The day of the meeting, my hands shook, but I didn't hide them. Mimi stayed at my feet, her eyes never leaving the door. Victor arrived first, smug and relaxed. Barbara followed, perfectly composed, her smile practiced and effortless. They sat across from me like this was just another transaction. "So," Barbara said lightly, "have you come to your senses?" "I want this to be over," I replied, keeping my voice soft. Victor laughed. "Smart." We talked, circled, pretended. Every word they spoke tightened the net a little more. Then Barbara sighed impatiently. "This is exhausting," she said. "Your brother dragged things out the same way, always begging." Victor glanced at her sharply. She waved it off. "Oh, please." He was so pathetic, begging us to leave Daphne alone before the medication took effect. The room went utterly still. I felt it in my bones. The shift. The moment truth stepped into the light, Rachel moved, and Barbara realized, too late, that she had just told the world exactly who she was. The room seemed to breathe out all at once. Rachel's hand was already moving, her voice calm and sharp as she spoke into her radio. The recording device lay quietly on the table, innocent-looking. Having just captured the sentence that destroyed everything Barbara and Victor had built on lies. Barbara's face changed first. Not fear calculation. Then, slowly, something like panic crept in around the edges. "You're twisting my words," she said quickly. "That's not what I meant." Victor stood up so fast his chair scraped loudly against the floor. "This meeting is over." Rachel stepped between them and the door. "No," she said, "it isn't." Uniformed officers entered moments later. The cafe, which had once felt so safe and familiar, now felt charged, suspended between grief and justice. Barbara's confidence cracked when the cuffs went on. Victor protested loudly, his voice rising, insisting on lawyers and misunderstandings, but no one listened. The evidence was too clear. The recording, the medical records, the letters, the pattern of control. Emma stood frozen near the counter, watching as the man she had married, the man she had defended to herself for years, was led away. Then she collapsed, not dramatically, just folded, as if her body had finally accepted what her mind had been refusing. "He killed my father," she whispered, her voice barely there. "He killed your brother." I held her as she cried, the weight of it crushing us both. There is a special kind of grief reserved for the moment you realize love has been weaponized against you, that the person you trusted most was capable of something unforgivable. Mimi lay pressed against us, grounding, steady, her presence a reminder that not all loyalty betrays. Later, alone, the truth finally caught up with me. Thomas had not simply died. He had been hurried toward death by greed. By people who looked at his fear and saw opportunity. By family. I sat at my kitchen table long after the sun had gone down, staring at nothing, feeling the ache settle deep in my bones. Grief returned, not the raw shock from before, but something heavier. Final. "I'm sorry," I whispered into the quiet. "I should have protected you." The world outside moved fast after that. News vans parked outside the cafe. Headlines spread across screens and phones. Interviews were requested. Comment sections filled with outrage and support and disbelief. The story traveled far beyond Portland. But inside me, everything was very still. Days later, Emma returned Thomas's belongings. Boxes stacked neatly, handled with care, as if respect could undo what had already been done. I unpacked them slowly. His books, his watch, old photos, the sweater he wore when he used to visit the cafe and complain about the coffee being too strong. At the bottom of the last box, I found an envelope. My name written in his careful hand. Inside was a small key and a note. Daphne, if you're reading this, I'm gone. This key opens the truth. Trust only Mimi's owner. Thomas. I read it again. And again. My breath caught. Mimi's owner? I looked down at her, curled at my feet, looking up at me with the same trusting eyes she always had. But I am, I whispered. The key felt warm in my palm. And suddenly, I understood Thomas still had one more truth left to give me. The note stayed with me all night. I read it again and again, turning it over in my hands as if the paper itself might explain what Thomas had meant. Mimi slept curled against my ankle, blissfully unaware that her name, her simple, comforting name, had become a riddle left by a dying man. Trust only Mimi's owner. I whispered the words into the dark. They didn't make sense. I was Mimi's owner. I always had been. And then, somewhere between exhaustion and memory, the truth surfaced. Thomas had owned a corgi once, years ago, long before my cafe, long before Victor. Her name had been Mimi too. I sat up so fast I startled my own dog, Samuel. The name came to me with a sudden clarity that made my chest tighten. Samuel Price, Thomas's old business partner. His closest friend before life scattered them in different directions. The man who had given Thomas that first corgi, who used to joke that Mimi belonged to Sam in practice and to Thomas in spirit. Trust only Mimi's owner. Not me, Samuel. The drive to Seattle felt strangely calm, as if the chaos had burned itself out, leaving behind a quiet determination. Mimi rode beside me, head resting on the seat, the city slowly giving way to long stretches of road and thought. Samuel lived in a modest house overlooking the water. He was 75 now, thinner than I remembered, his hair almost entirely white, but his eyes were the same, sharp, gentle, watchful. When I told him why I was there, he closed his eyes. I was afraid this day would come, he said softly. He invited me inside, made tea with hands that shook just a little, and finally retrieved a small metal key from his pocket. I've been keeping this for Thomas, he said. He didn't trust anyone else. At the bank, the safety deposit box slid open with a quiet click. Inside was a folder, thick, carefully organized. A second will. My name stared back at me from the first page. Everything Riverside, the remaining assets, the estate left to me. Explicitly, clearly, undeniably, but it was the flash drive beneath the papers that stole my breath. Samuel plugged it into his laptop, and suddenly my brother was there, alive, pale, but lucid, looking straight into the camera. If you're watching this, Thomas said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. Then Victor followed through on his threats. And Barbara helped him. I pressed my hand to my mouth. Thomas spoke calmly, about pressure, about intimidation, about medication that made him foggy, then helpless, about his fear for me. I didn't want Daphne dragged into this, he said, but if they try to take what's ours, please, let her fight with the truth. I cried then, quietly, fully, the kind of tears that come not just from loss, but from being seen one last time by someone you loved. Samuel put a hand over mine. He trusted you, he said, more than anyone. On the drive back to Portland, the folder sat on the passenger seat like something sacred, final, complete. Justice, at last, felt within reach. Then my phone rang. The hospital number flashed on the screen. "Ma'am," a voice said urgently, "there's been a fire at your cafe. You need to come immediately." The road blurred in front of me. And once again, just when I thought the truth had finally settled, the past reached out with fire in its hands. I thought the cafe was gone when I arrived. The smell of smoke still clung to the air, sharp and bitter. And for one terrifying moment my heart refused to listen to reason. I stood there, frozen, Mimi, trembling beside me, until James came toward us, his face smudged with soot, but his posture steady as ever. "It didn't spread," he said calmly. "Sprinklers kicked in, mostly smoke damage. Only then did I breathe." He told me what happened in short, clipped sentences. Victor hadn't come himself. He'd sent someone else, desperate, reckless. The man had slipped in after midnight, thinking no one would be there. James had been there. "I saw him before he lit anything," James said. "Held him until the police arrived." I looked at the cafe, the walls blackened near the back, the windows intact, the place still standing. And I understood something quietly powerful. This place had been protected, not by luck, by community. In the weeks that followed, the truth finished its work. The evidence Samuel gave me changed everything. The second will, the video, the financial records, the medical proof. There was no room left for denial, no space for clever lawyers to twist reality. Victor and Barbara faced it all: fraud, animal cruelty, manslaughter, attempted arson, maximum charges. When the judge spoke Thomas's name out loud, something inside me finally settled. Not healed, but acknowledged. Emma filed for divorce quietly. No celebration. No drama, just resolve. She started therapy, learning to untangle love from fear, guilt from responsibility. Some days she cried. Some days she laughed again, surprised by the sound of it. I inherited Riverside, the land Thomas once dreamed about, but I didn't sell it. I walked it slowly, imagining what it could become if gentleness replaced cruelty, if fear gave way to care. We named it Thomas's Haven, a real sanctuary, open land, clean shelters, vet care, space to run, space to rest. Dogs who had known nothing but cages, learning what grass felt like beneath their paws. Emma came to work there every day. She didn't say much at first. She just showed up, cleaned, fed, sat quietly with the dogs who flinched at human touch. Slowly they trusted her, and slowly she trusted herself again. When the cafe reopened, I expected sympathy. I didn't expect joy. People lined up down the block. They brought flowers, donations, stories. Rescued dogs from Thomas's Haven came with volunteers, tails wagging nervously as potential adopters knelt down to meet them. The cafe was louder than it had ever been, warmer, alive. One afternoon, when the rush finally faded, I sat at my favorite table with Mimi curled at my feet. Sunlight poured through the windows. Dogs slept under chairs. People laughed softly over coffee. I took out Thomas's final letter. "Daphne, you always saw the good in people. Don't let this change that. But when pushed, you're stronger than anyone knows. Protect what matters. Love always, Thomas." My hands didn't shake this time. I looked down at Mimi and smiled. "We did it, girl," I whispered. "Justice for Thomas, and a new beginning for all of us." If this story moved you, if you believe quiet strength matters, consider subscribing to the channel. There are more stories like this about resilience, loyalty, and the courage to protect what truly matters.